Te doy otro.
Sí.
A ver.
Sí. Bueno, tú ya lo sabes, ¿verdad? Odessa College of the Arts. Es que estábamos hablando, ¿te gustó? ¿Viste Tony Soprano?
¿Cómo que lo vi?
Sí, viste la serie.
Sí, claro, me encantó.
Mira, también Jaime fue adicto a Los Soprano.
No, es que Los Soprano, yo los tengo integrados a mi vida, yo constantemente estoy citando a Tony.
O sea, cómo el actor, el sufrimiento de estar encargado, porque con el Godfather, no sé, era el pater familias, no había problema, ya tuvo control de todo. Tony siempre estaba casi iba a perder todo, la locura,
Pues está con una psiquiatra y así empieza.
Sí, exactamente. En realidad la mente fue muy débil, ¿verdad? Tuvo miedo.
Es que era un hombre sencillo.
Sí, pero súper inteligente, pero supo que tenía bastantes problemas.
Y todo estaba anclado en la infancia.
Sí, exactamente, con la mamá. Sí.
O sea, por eso que está muy bien. Que
yo le culpo a mi mamá también. Todo. ¿Sabes qué? Cuando estuve...
Todo. No, por favor, nunca digas eso delante de mis hijos.
No, bueno, 50% a la mamá, mi mamá, y 50% a la iglesia.
No, la iglesia todo.
O sea, la monja, la Sister Willie, cuando hicimos la First Communion,
la primera comunión,
le dijo a mi mamá, ¿sabes qué, Jaime? Sería un cura. Muy bueno, un cura. Excelente. Y ya me casé y todo el matrimonio. Y amaba a mi mamá. Los niños, ¿están embarazados? Y mamá, no estamos embarazados. Bueno,
sí,
bueno.
Claro.
Pero también cada Navidad o las vacaciones. Y la Sister Willie, no, ¿por qué no deciste cura? Dije, mamá, ¿quieres hijos? ¿Quieres nietos? Y quieres que yo el cura. Eso ya no pasa. Uno, la mano izquierda y la mano derecha. Y todavía dice, le dijo a mi hijo, mira, Ben, tu papá podría ser una cura.
Es the Dean of Science and
Letters in Science.
Richard Sachs.
Richard Sachs, Dean of Science and
Yo qué sé.
Humanities. No, me imagino yo. Voy a ir.
Te digo, esto es para... Mira.
¿Ya está todo?
Sí, para los agradecimientos.
Odessa College Degree, the Department of History, the Latin American Writer Series, and Richard Sachs, the Dean of Science
¿Se puede
Humanity.
referir a una universidad como UTPB?
Sí, o University of Texas, por ejemplo.
No, UTPB.
Por eso pregunto.
UTPB será más fácil.
Sí, UTPB.
Bueno, lo que no sé qué es cuál es el proceso.
Aquí que no se duerme.
Esto lo sigo acá. Este es lo que... ¿Dónde te lo pongo?
No son mis notas.
¿Te los pongo acá?
Déjame ver. ¿Qué vas a escribir? ¿Qué tanto? No, usa la página.
Ok.
Así creen que escribí un montón para preparar todo. Mira, te voy a contar. Voy a hablar de Trump, de Sócrates, de Bob Dylan, de Kendrick Lamar. Y el fin, la conclusión, no te voy a decir, pero te va a encantar. Y no voy a durar 2 o 3 minutos.
¿Sí?
De todo, pero vas a estar. Estaba escribiendo, chingón, te va a estar bien también. Pero voy a estar a todo, con Trump. Pero,
De Sopranos, ¿cuál fue tu escena? O una de tus escenas favoritas.
cuando sale del hospital y todavía está muy débil y lo están ignorando en la oficina, ¿verdad? En su oficina, lo están ignorando porque están, y está en el baño y está así, chinga su madre, y sale, está enfermo, pero sale y le da un chingazo el jovencito, ¿verdad? La guardia. Sí, para enseñar que todavía es el más,
el jefe,
el más fuerte. Y el pobre joven, que lo quería tanto, el jovencito, lo corrieron y patazos, y él era el víctima de ¿cómo se dice? Del Tony. El víctima de su Tony DeVille, el víctima de ese pobre joven.
Lidia, qué personaje siniestro.
¿Sabes su última película? ¿Viste la última película de él con Tom Hardy? Oh, esa es buenísima. Luis. Oh, no, esa
¿Cómo se fue a morir?
Oh, no,
Y
esa
no
película.
puede
¿Has visto cómo se llama The Drop? The Drop.
The Drop. The Last Drop.
The Last Drop. ¿Has visto?
No.
Con Tom Hardy.
¿Pero qué? ¿Se consigue Netflix o algo?
En HBO ahorita.
Ok.
No, es porque siempre está fracasado. Todos los caracteres de él es fracasado. Sí, sí, tiene miedo, ¿no? Así, pero sí, te tiene miedo.
Espérame, recuérdame. ¿Cómo se llama? Mana.
No, estoy viendo. No sé.
Es que se me van ahorita.
Sí, la hermana de Tony mata al novio.
Al de la peluca, al de la peluca.
Sí, sí.
A Jackie, a Pura.
Jackie.
Jackie.
No, Jackie. No, Jackie es el.
Sí, me
el otro
intentaron.
jefe. No, Jackie no es la hermana.
No,
Pero
no.
después fue el novio de...
Oh, sí, 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 sí. Sí, sí, sí. Sí,
es
es cierto.
¿Qué le quito su mujer la
Sí.
conciencia? Sí, tiraron el piso y voy. O sea, el ridículo.
Sí.
Y luego la manera de hablar a Prillen. ¿Cómo hablaba él? Así.
No, verdaderamente lo más falso que en el universo. ¿Sabes qué
no, la
personaje?
forma,
La que me cayó muy bien, como el personaje la novia de
También, pobrecita, ¿verdad?
con su
Oye,
señor.
sí, ¿te acuerdas cuando trajeron a ese italiano que era el que iba a cobrar?
Sí.
Que hablaba.
Furio.
Y cuando va con el médico, está jugando golf y dice, hey, mi tío pues, ha tenido un problema y el médico no lo atiende. Es como lo ofenden al pobre médico.
Pero para buscar el dinero en el apartamento de los jovencitos, cuando llegó Julio con Michael, ¿no? No, uno de los otros.
Yo creo que además se enamora de Conrad.
Sí.
No saben ni escribir en inglés, me dejan unos recados ahí todos.
No, pero él nunca supo.
Oye, la hija se llama Mero.
Mero.
Escríbeme un recado que dice Mero. M-D-O. Mero.
Pero él nunca supo que Caramela estaba enamorada con él. Él nunca supo.
No estoy seguro que coqueteaba.
Sí, es que el Carmela veía en Furio, era el hombre, digamos, salvaje.
No, nada más eso. No será una persona tensa.
Sencillo, pero
Sí.
Cuando van a cobrarle algunos adeudos a una filipina y es la primera vez y entra y destruye a la pobre filipina el marido.
A los dos primero. Pero igual ella, que fue una ladrona, fue una mujer horrible. En ese caso.
Creo que mis hijos estarían en el cielo aquí platicando. Y se hacen diálogos.
Sí.
¿Entiendes? Se empiezan a intercambiar entre ellos cuando se ven.
¿Sabes la otra serie? Es la The Wire.
Ahí es lo máximo.
Es el
Pero es
¿sí?
totalmente otro tipo de serie.
No, sí,
Porque es la
totalmente.
cosa de Baltimore, de los negros.
Sí, ya.
Sí, es bueno.
Buenísimo.
Sí, es que después de que vi De Sopranos ya no quise volver a...
Serie.
No, es la gran serie.
Sí.
No,
Pero The Wire
Game
mejor.
of Thrones, eso sí lo
Es
sé.
que The Wire, pues, eso
Sí,
Sí,
también.
The Wire está buena.
¿Y sabes por qué? Para mí, el final, cuando la serie se termina, cada uno de los caracteres nos dijeron que iba a pasar a ellos. Terminaron sabiendo que él iba a morir, él se murió, pobrecito, él iba a ser como el círculo de la pobreza.
Sí.
¿verdad?
I told you, it's a golem.
¿Sabes?
Sí, pero en Game of Thrones, no, el final no me gustó, porque para mí John fueron traidores a John. Él debía ser el rey. Esa pinche, ¿cómo es la hermana? El Queen of the North.
Oh,
Sansa.
sí.
Se cambió a Cersei, ¿no? Y voy al baño.
Pero sabes que me encantan los de Escandinavia. Todos. Estoy viendo uno de Islandia.
¿Cuál es?
Se llama The Entrapment.
Es sobre
En Netflix.
cuestiones sobre policías.
Policías, hay una pantalla de
Esas series
motocicleta.
son extraordinarias.
Son los mejores. Para mí, ellos,
Las nórdicas.
los rusos, sufren todo. Ellos saben todo porque han sufrido todo. En serio.
Bueno, esa es la que te venden, ¿verdad?
Sí, ok, ahorita regreso.
Oye, pero esa no es, ¿eh?
¿Cuál?
Esa no es la primera página, ¿no importa? No. La van a cambiar.
A ver,
me imagino.
sí, a ver, dime aquí.
A ver, ahí, ¿dónde está el papelito?
Aquí está, mira. Es que no, el...
¿Tú eres doctor?
sí.
La primera es el palo de lluvia. No, hasta el final. Síguete, síguete. No. 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 A ver. No, no. Esta. No, tampoco. Este es, no, es el palo de lluvia.
A lo de lluvia, aquí también. ¿Ahí está?
Sí. Ok. Sí. Luego, nunca después. No, esto se lo digo un poco. Tiene que estar.
Aquí está.
Nunca después.
Sí.
En inglés y en español.
A lo de lluvia.
Está.
Ah, mira, aquí está, los tres, mira. Genial. Palo de lluvia, nunca después.
¿Y el soneto? No, está el soneto. Ah, no tengo que apuntar el soneto. Este es el soneto.
Ahí está, mira.
Los primeros palo de lluvia, luego nunca después, y never again. Esa es la que yo hice la parte de lluvia, ¿no? Luego sigue el cadáver, ese cadáver. Es la que tiene la obra de arreglo. No, es la que tiene la obra de arreglo.
¿Ahí? No.
Esta, pero esa no es la primera página. ¿Ya ves sigue?
Aquí está esto.
No.
Esto.
No. No. Es esta y la que sigue.
Lo que sigue sería esta.
Ese es el 2.
Vale, ahí está.
Ese es el 2, ¿no?
Vale. Bien, pero va a estar ahí, mira.
Ese es el 3, perdón.
Pero van a estar las cuatro. Sí. Sí, no, sí. Ahí está, mira.
Y luego hay gente que...
¿Aquí?
Es esta.
Ahí está.
Esta y la que sigue.
Y la que sigue sería esta.
Ese es.
Ahí está.
Y luego el soneto.
Y ahí está.
¿No llega la gente?
¿Ah?
¿No llega la gente? Tres gatos, ¿no? Una carta. ¿Me va a presentar ella?
Sí, sí, sí.
Ok, tú no me enterarías,
No,
¿verdad?
no.
Bueno, ok.
¿Qué pasa? ¿Qué? Aquí estoy de technician.
Técnico, técnico.
¿Estás bien? Sí, déjate presento. Hola, Paquita.
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
¿Cómo estás?
Really? Oh, it's great that you remind me that you're here.
Mucho gusto.
Mucho gusto. ¿Es colega de Antonio?
Sí, un foto nada más.
Bueno, mi apellido Colomé es catalán. ¿Sí? Wow. Digo, ya sabrás, es una historia. Yo sé que es de procedencia catalana, pero como mi abuelo catalán, Colomé, era el villano de la obra, desapareció ahí de la vida y abandonó todo el mundo. Entonces, yo no. ¿Es Colomé o Colomé?
Colomé,
Sí,
normalmente es Colomé,
sí.
pero
No, Colomé es inevitable. Todos los colombianos
Hace unos milenios. No nos vemos desde hace 10 años. Yo sé. Fue aquí cada día.
que sí, es un apellido que
Yeah, I love the book.
Gómez,
Hi, can I ask everyone to move up a row? There's not going to be a quiz. Nobody's going to be called upon. Don't be afraid. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Hey, where's the paper? You gave me that. Did you give it to me? The thank yous? She got. ¿Te dio el papel para dar todas las gracias?
Really? 5 minutes or so.
About a year.
Give or take.
La importancia de la traducción.
Really?
Translación.
Qué chiquito es el mundo, ¿eh?
After early translating.
No, gotcha. No, pero todos los thank yous. Es que te dije. You need pen?
Forrest Gump, right? Very. And CD was good.
But yeah, I was very impressed. I only read the English translation. But really great stuff. I'd never heard of her before until your son sent me the stuff. But I bought a copy and it's pretty
Don't
terrific.
ask me more questions. Yeah, no, he's very, very happy. Living in California all the time.
¿Qué sería en castellano?
With his son, from New York.
Palabra de Dios. No.
And, look at the back, there might be a title, I think it won an award.
¿Yo? Sí, sí, sí. Bueno, no, yo soy chileno. Yo soy de la Ciudad de México. Soy rata de Almañal.
He vivido 28 años. Era vivido, pero rato. Que también cuenta, ¿no? Pero 28 años.
Okay, I didn't know that. Okay. So I picked a good one. The best of the best.
Ah, sí, muy cerquita.
Yo tuve, sí, mira, cuando la conocí, yo sé que con mi hijo y mi único nieto, aparte de sus proyectos, que compartimos
Todos son gran familia.
pero claro, el mío es muy chiquito.
Ajá.
Y fui a Conrad y
Ajá. ¿Que vive allá en Colomé? Ajá, ok. Es que yo no.
So when you publish something of this quality in Mexico,
Yo vivo en la montaña, en Colomé, ni siquiera vivo en la parte taquillera, en el calor y los albergues de eso.
the States,
Yo vivo en la montaña, en la subida de Chalma,
or Latin America in general.
Okay.
Pues es que mi esposo es profesor, investigador de la UNAM.
He wants it back. You have to give it back.
Y después de que me lo crearon un instituto de investigación de la UNAM, digo, no es como diversificar eso.
But I was impressed. There were some words she used I didn't know. Like, okay. Breaking up the dictionary.
Fuera de la y luego vino el 86.
Oh, great.
¿Y te tocó el tema, no?
What's your favorite part? Section
¿Qué
that
me
impressed you?
de eso?
You know, I mean, I just thought it was like the.
Ustedes dicen.
Hi, I'm Chris Brown.
Ay,
wonderful book. Yeah.
Good.
I
Really?
Yeah, I read it, finished reading it last night, so it's freshly read.
Wonderful question.
Okay. I don't know if you, would you mind signing it? Would that be possible?
¿Sí lo firmas?
To sign? Okay. I appreciate it. I was just dazzled, very impressed.
Really? Yeah, good.
Yeah. The cover's at home, I didn't want to scuff the cover.
¿Estamos a punto?
Looking forward to your lecture.
Vamos a comenzar al punto.
De
De manera gringa, pura americana.
Well, I can relate, I don't know how much either. Okay.
¿Vamos a comenzar? ¿Comenzamos?
Showtime?
You know this week's she had no idea. You remember that? It's horrible.
We're going to go ahead and start. I'm going to ask again. There's not going to be a quiz. So if any of you in the back would like to sit closer to the front, but you won't be on camera. So, but to start, my name is Jaime Aguila. I'm a professor of history at Midland College. And from 1999 to 2007, I was a professor of history here. And I remember when this was a library with my good friend Joanna Hajikastani. So before we start, I'd like to give some thank yous to the groups and individuals who have provided the financial support. The Odessa Arts Council, and the University UTPB, the Department of History at UTPB, the Latin American Writer Series, and which is Dr. Antonio Moreno. ¿Dónde estás, Antonio? There, who's responsible single-handedly for putting this all together. This is a passion of his, and we're thankful for his work. And then Richard Sachs, Dean of Science and Humanities at UTPB. And before I introduce Pura López Colomé, I'm asked to make a few comments, and unlike my classes at Midland College, hopefully you won't fall asleep. So this is about the art of the written word and translation. And the written word in itself, there used to be an era when poets and journalists, novelists were something that we used to call public intellectuals. And if you think about the political concept, make America great again, there really was an era in the past when the public intellectual was a very important person, not just in politics, but culturally, internationally, transnationally. And we were talking earlier about examples of that. And I'm a big sports fan. Buda's a big sports fan. We're baseball fans. And baseball is extremely boring. I understand that. But baseball is not meant to be watched on television, unless you're at a game, and even at the game, worried about hot dogs and talking with your friends, or yelling at your son like I used to. But baseball is a game that's meant to be heard. And there was back in the day that you would just listen to it on the radio. Back home, if you lived somewhere in the middle of nowhere, I can remember my fondest memories as a child was listening to Fernando Valenzuela pitch his first 9 starts. He won all 9. And I can imagine those because of the radio. So there was, back in the day, life was, I think, a little simpler, but in a lot of ways, we appreciated the written word more. So if you bear with me a few more minutes, there was in Plato's Phaedrus, Plato, again, back in the day, Plato describes Socrates when writing, the written word is presented to him. And Socrates is very concerned because he feels the written word will make society, for lack of a better phrase, dumber. He says that, well, now someone's ideas can be stolen, and once it's written down, he compared them to a painting, mistakenly, that the painting will never change. And we know that's not true today because as history's evolved, paintings mean different things to different cultures. And so the written word in itself, especially poetry, evolves and it remains important because its meaning changes depending on a given person or what's going on at a given point in time. And then if you think about Bob Dylan, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2016, if you want to expand what the written word is. And the Nobel Prize Committee described Bob Dylan's lyrics as poetry, and the importance of poetry and how Bob Dylan expresses the evolution of American society. And then in 2017, you have Kendrick Lamar winning the Pulitzer Prize. And I'm going to give you the quote what the Pulitzer Prize Committee says about Kendrick Lamar. And he wins a Pulitzer Prize to articulate in human terms the intimate specifics of daily self-defense from your surroundings. Okay, so a tremendous respect for the evolution of hip-hop music, an inherently American tradition. But you have today, you have hip-hop stars speaking Quechua in Bolivia. You have hip-hop in the Middle East. You have hip-hop, different interpretation of hip-hop all over the world. And some of the best hip-hop music is not in a Western language, certainly not in English, certainly not in Spanish. And so again, the importance of the written word. And maybe the most important example, the clearest example of the evolution of language is in 2293 back then, 2293, Chancellor Gorkon, speaking to Commander Spock, tells Spock that you cannot understand Shakespeare unless you experience it in the original Klima. And that leads into the role of translation. Professor, I'm going to say Pura, my friend Pura, has translated the work of two different Nobel Prize laureates in literature. Seamus Hamey, who's world-renowned, and arguments can be made that he's the most important poet of the last 100 years, passed away, I think, in the 80s. And then Louise Glück, an American poet who also won the Nobel Prize for Literature. She translates the work, and Irish is not an English language, it's Irish. It's indigenous to that part of the world. But you don't just translate someone's work, especially somebody like Seamus Hamey. You have to be an expert in a lot of different aspects of not just language, but culture, and a certain point in time. So, and you go through a massive peer review process and a translation from Irish to different languages is as impressive as, in a lot of ways, as publishing a book that becomes a bestseller. Now, Pura López Colomé, who born in Mexico, Mexico City, but considers herself a Southerner Sureña from Yucatan, and she's lived quite a life, a tremendous amount of experiences, including part of her life here in the United States. She's translated, or she's published her own work over 16, maybe 17 different books of poetry, and then she has various translations from different authors. And again, Irish is as different a language, even more so than Texan and then normal English, I mean, at that level. So I'd like to introduce Pura López Colomé. Come on up, and we appreciate you being here.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to repeat some thanks here to the Odessa Arts, UTPB, the Department of History, Latin American Writers Series, and the Dean of Science and Humanities, Richard Sachs. But most of all, I want to thank my two friends, Antonio Moreno and Jaime Aguilar, for being so supportive and for showing such an interest in my work. I am a poet, mainly because I am a frustrated musician. Music is a proof of God's existence. I mean, poetry is not a second-class thing, but it's not music. But if there is no music inside poetry, I don't think poetry really, exists, because I really believe in the music inside it. And I don't see much difference between writing a poem and translating a poem. And so what I'm going to read for you tonight is sort of that belief made an essay. Poetry is translation. It happens, occurs, takes place, seeps in, travels, flows. I'd like to begin this talk with a poem that sums up everything that poetry is, thereby eliminating any risky explanation concerning its core. Poetry turns futile and idle any description, commentary, or annotation one might provide it with, demonstrating by its mere selfhood that it lacks nothing, it can stand on its own. The poem I'm referring to, the author is pretty obvious by now, language with a maximum possible load of energy, chain of words in full harmony, is actually a mystery, just like the one that was repeated to me time and time again when I was a child as a definition of God. 3 persons that are enclosed in one, thereby constituting the Holy Trinity. A God, one and triune. I remember having accepted these questions at face value without even understanding them, trying to imagine them on my own at night in silence, mesmerized by the beauty of the expression itself, one and triune. I will now put aside my personal darkness to go to the point. Here we have not only that unique being divided in 3, but formed in the poem by multiple voices, a sort of credible miracle. Flames landing on both intellect and heart, not propitiating the gift of tongues, but that of meanings. Here is the original by the great Seamus Heaney, and you will see it here, next to which stands my version on its modest feet of clay. And because this talk is about translation, I'm going to read in both languages so that the music is here in the air. Seamus Heaney says, the rain stick, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with the actual rain stick, the instrument that is the rain stick. Upend the rain stick. And what happens next is a music that you never would have known to listen for. In a cactus stalk, downpour, sluice rush, spillage and backwash come flowing through. You stand there like a pipe being played by water. You shake it again lightly, and diminuendo runs through all its scales like a gutter stopping trickling. Now here comes a sprinkle of drops out of the freshened leaves. Then subtle wets of grass and daisies. Then glitter drizzle, almost breaths of air. Up in the stick again, and what happens next is undiminished for having happened once, twice, 10, 1,000 times before. Who cares if all the music that transpires is a fall of grit or dry seeds through a cactus? You're like a rich man entering heaven through the ear of a raindrop. Listen now, again. In terms of music, here comes the music of Spanish. El palo de lluvia. Voltea el palo de lluvia y lo que pasa es una música que nunca imaginaste en los oídos. En un tallo de cactus, aguacero, embestida la esclusa, derrame, resaca. Y como si el agua tocara la gaita, te quedas quieto, lo mueves otro poco, y un diminuendo corre por todas las escalas como una coladera que dejara de gotear. Y viene de nuevo, un salpicar de gotas desde las hojas frescas. Luego, perlas sutiles sobre pasto y margaritas. Luego, brisnas esplendorosas, casi alientos de aire. Voltéalo para el otro lado, lo que pasa no sufre merma por haber pasado ya 1, 2, 10, 1000 veces antes. ¿Qué más da si toda la música que resuma es caída de arena o semillas secas por un cactus. Eres el hombre rico que entra al cielo por el oído de una gota de lluvia. Oye, óyela de nuevo. First of all, this experience requires letting one's conscience be absorbed by the capacities of the ear and the sequence of sounds, what the author, Seamus Heaney, calls the sound of sense. What follows is the apparition inside heart and brain of the ritual instrument we all know, plus the slow configuration of image. If one is able to conceive 3 persons in one God, it will be a lot easier to imagine what happens thanks to a combination of syllables and silences as if by magic. Nature and its phenomena, the person and its senses, within the grasp of our comprehension and delight, because of an object defined by the dictionary thus. The rain or water stick is a large hollow tube full of seeds, inside which little wooden or bamboo sticks are set, following a helix, extended from top to bottom. In other words, this magic wand turns into the baton of a sorcerer that makes his wishes come true. Not only that, it goes further still to an afterlife, where plurality of meaning is born. Exactly what characterizes poetry. A realization of language, where a condition of multiplicity can occur. Each word is many, each line is many, each stanza is many stanzas as well. And if this were not enough, in this case, what I stressed in my Spanish quotation is a translation, el valor lluvia, a text that in order to prove its identity adds something, an element that, according to the great George Steiner, must appear in any respectable version. Something new that was already there. What is new in this case? The poem in English starts up in the rain stick, and what happens next is the treasure to unearth lies in the verb happen, to occur, to take place. Thanks to the Spanish language, the added bonus is the verb pasar, that not only connotes the happening itself, but also the flowing, going through, moving about, exactly what water does. Prodigies of this sort are a gift to the poet translator, a sort of identity confirmation. But before feeling comforted, stepping on firm ground, this poet translator, this one, recalls the ultra-quoted dictum by W.H. Auden in reference to the painful impotence of poetry that makes nothing happen, where he uses the same verb. In fact, poetry does not make it rain, does not bring back the dead. W.H. Auden seems to doubt, and then he continues, being in two minds about it, letting the poem flow on its own. If one does not only concentrate on that line, the ultra-quoted poetry makes nothing happen, the faceless voice seems to conclude, for poetry makes nothing happen. It survives into the valley of its saying, where executives would never want to temper. It flows south from ranches of isolation in the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives, a way of happening, a mouth. A mouth, both oracular, like the Sibyl's cave with its 100 entrances. It is never wrong when it addresses us directly. Seamus Heaney, author of The Rainstick, has deposited his questions inside Auden's cave, knowing that the definite growth rings of genius rang in his voice. With Heaney, I share, besides the conviction in pure and unbreakable lyricism, a spirituality nurtured by Catholic religiosity, communicating vessels between Ireland and Mexico. Like him, I believe that in fact, something happens and flows thanks to poetry and art in general. These activities transform us. After reading any true poet, say Auden himself, we don't see the world like we did before. In my case, the surviving mouth has been opening up in 1,000 ways to push me into trying to understand human misery, goodness, sadness, beauty, something huge projected by truth. Here's an example among many during childhood, when this actually happened. A chain of sounds that brought me this far. Something that keeps on, as we say here, going in one ear and out the other, that keeps me throwing little stones on the way in order to get back and land in the written word. The poem is part of my latest book of poems entitled Borrosa Imago Mundi, Blurred Imago Mundi. I don't know if I have the time to read in both languages. So just to give you the feel of the music. And you must forgive the translation because it's mine and it's not my native language. Nunca después. Oí a alguien mencionar con crudelísima ansiedad los Apeninos, avanzando por el túnel antemporal de la anestesia. Recuerdo acorralado, aunque no mío, una nube deshilachada entre cornisas, un algodón de nácar en la lengua. Ningún paisaje surgió espontáneamente, ofreciendo elementos de un mundo bien distinto, que dejara con la boca abierta, sin habla, sin poder describir o definir esa belleza, su insufrible, intolerable, hórrida armonía, su equilibrio doloroso. Desde la cóclea intuí el mensaje en clave. ¿Qué cumbres merecían ser de maltrata? Un paradigma de estrías expresivas, un rostro carcomido entre senderos. ¿Cuáles multiplicaban su presencia, llenándola de ceros, mil cumbres, surcando paso a paso el eje volcánico del norte, cicatrizando en frío su territorio? O, si resultaría quimera, tildar de borrascosas, alturas cortadas a la medida para arrojarse, precipitarse e ir rodando entero, luego quebrado, después poco a poco desmembrado, porque ya nada, en serio, nada tiene caso, porque no vale la pena vivir, como afirmaba el arzobispo Fulton J. Sheen, emergiendo sin cuerpo por las bocinas del radio en la lengua de Rambal, a temprana hora, los domingos de mi infancia. El son, nido en arrullo. Nadie sabe para quién trabaja, se repetía después en la cocina de la casa. Si bien entonces no entendía esa frase, hoy puedo salir de dudas con un equivalente. Ahora caigo. Gracias al prelado y a su cursi intensidad predicatriz, vi, aunque suene raro, que el oído impulse la visión y además sea desquiciante. Mi trayecto pendular, del color pálido al marino, en un salón hostil de un febrero de otro siglo, azul gasa de una herida o pabellón de hamaca, pluma de pavo real a contraluz envolvía mi pensamiento, sus entrañas criminales, manta de cielo, cabello de ángel arrogante, recién lavado y suelto, tan apenino que sin motivo vale la pena morir. Never again. I heard someone mention with the cruelest anxiety los Apeninos, advancing through the timeless tunnel of anesthesia, a caged memory, though not mine, a shredded cloud through cornices, mother of pearl cotton in the tongue. No landscape emerged spontaneously with elements of a very different world that would leave me speechless, open-mouthed, unable to describe or define such beauty, its insufferable, intolerable, horrific harmony, its painful equilibrium. From the cochlea, I intuited the coded message. What peaks deserved the name maltrata, a paradigm of expressive stretch marks, an emaciated face among the paths? Or which ones could multiply their presence, filling it with zeros, 1,000, plowing the northern volcanic axis step by step, leaving a cold scar along its territory? Or, if it were a chimera, to stigmatize as withering, heights trimmed exactly to push you, hurl your body till it rolls completely, gets broken bit by bit till it's dismembered, because nothing, really nothing, is worthwhile anymore, revealing the untruth of life is worth living, as stressed by Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, emerging bodilessly through the radio speakers in the language of Rambal in the early hours of my childhood Sundays. The sound lulling, sound nest cuddling. You never know. It was repeated in the kitchen afterwards. Although I didn't understand that phrase, I can clear up my doubts with an equivalent. Now I get it. Thanks to the prelate and his tacky preaching, I could see, even if it sounds strange, that the ear could push the vision forward and turn it maddening, really see my bouncing movement from pale to navy blue inside a hostile hall of another century's reverie. Blue gauze of a wound or thin cloth over a hammock, a peacock's feather against a backlight, wrapping up my thoughts, their cloudy criminal entrails, like haughty angel hair, just washed and loose. So Apennino that wantonly death could be worth dying for. Mouths and emissions on their own have come to me through writing and or translating and or writing. Although the poem Never Again is one of my tormenting poems, the rainstick is and is not one also. I leave that decision to the reader because it is actually the translation, which generally and hopelessly is considered at best a shade, a more or less fortunate or unfortunate shadow of the original. Which of the two realizations is worth more? Concerning his own work, Fray Luis de León famously said, "Of that which is translated, he who wishes to be judge should first try to translate elegant poetry written in a foreign language into his own, without adding or subtracting sentence, and keeping as much as possible the figures of the original and their grace, and having them speak Castilian, and not as a foreigner would or a novice, but as if they had been born in it, in its nature. I am not saying that I have done this, nor am I that arrogant, but I have tried to do it, and thus confess it." In her marvelous book, This Little Art, I mean, if you don't know this book, you're missing something really incredible. It's very easy to get. In her marvelous book, This Little Art, Kate Briggs had this to say about the great translator Javier Marías. When asked about teaching creative writing, Marías replied, "I have not got involved with the creative writing industry, but if I ever had my own creative writing school, I would only admit people who could translate, and I would make them do it over and over and over again." Marías was pretty arrogant himself. take this with a grain of salt, of what is said and or omitted in the poem, Fray Luis demands of the voices that emerge from it to speak Castilian as if they had been born in it, in its nature. Isn't this what one does when writing? To begin with, it is language who should occupy the first place, who should place itself one step ahead of what is expressed, because without it, there's nothing. The great Czesław Miłosz, having fled his country and emigrated to Berkeley, California, recognizes the situation, or rather the condition. And by the way, Bob Hass was his translator, always, Robert Hass, fantastic translation. This is Miłosz, translated by Bob Hass. My faithful mother tongue. Faithful mother tongue, I have been serving you. Every night, I used to set before you little bowls of colors as you could have your so you could have your birch, your cricket, your finch, as preserved in my memory. This lasted many years. You were my native land. I lacked any other. I believed that you would also be a messenger between me and some good people, even if they were few, 20, 10, or not born as yet. Now, I confess my doubts. There are moments when it seems to me I have squandered my life. For you are a tongue of the debased, of the unreasonable, hating themselves even more than they hate other nations. A tongue of informers, a tongue of the confused, ill with their own innocence. But without you, who am I? Only a scholar in a distant country. A success without fears and humiliations, yes. Who am I without you? Just a philosopher, like everyone else. I understand this is meant as my education. The glory of individuality is taken away. Fortune spreads a red carpet before the sheen of a morality play, while on the linen backdrop, a magic lantern throws images of human and divine torture. Faithful mother tongue, perhaps after all, it is I who must try to save you. So, I would continue to set before you little bowls of colors, bright and pale if possible. For what is needed in misfortune is a little order and beauty. These are painful reflections. An author that has been tempted by the foreign language, English, he is immersed in. When Miłosz realized what was happening, what his role actually was, he decided to write poetry only in Polish. As for me, I keep trying to approach, as a marauder would, the mystery inside words, the verb made flesh in different and the same voices of each language. What would the written word in English be without Emily Dickinson? What would English have done without the great recluse? A language that also allowed historical, temporal coexistence of the minimalist attitude of this poet next to the maximalist, overwhelming tendencies of Walt Whitman. Two authors that lived only some kilometers away from each other and never met in person. Without English, neither the brief, sonorous, and resounding song of the oven bird, nor the strange, unchained Whitmanian rhapsody that proclaimed greatness of all American people would have reached us. How should one define the undefinable? Maybe in the undefinable lies the definition of its essence. It would not be so far-fetched then to deal with the undefinable in cases definably concrete, always keeping Borges in mind. Borges said, St. Augustine said, "What is time? If I am not asked what it is, I know. If I am asked what it is, I don't know." I can say the same about poetry. According to him, it is enough with emotions triggered by it, with the deep certainty of its contact. Emily Dickinson does not speak in Borges terms about what is and what is not. She does not detect the heat inside the poetic element, but the cold. A cold nothing can take away. She doesn't refer to what enters thought, but of visceral, intense questions. She tells her mentor, T.W. Higginson, "If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold, no fire can ever warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only ways I know it. Is there any other way?" I only let poetry land in its own terms, through metaphor or image. Those of us who write it, read it, value it, must safeguard it while letting her safeguard us, highlighting its double face, protected as well as protecting. When recognizing its importance, I immediately feel tempted to go on pulling that golden thread, to take it further, to give continuity to inspiration. I'm a believer in inspiration. Inspiration. Not understanding inspiration as a divine thunder and lightning that can hit us, but as that which detonates, which unchains the writing of the poem. A memory, a dream, a loss, a desire, a vision, pain, love, trauma, a certain trip. The word itself, articulated by chance, or read somewhere, heard by stealth through the wall of a hotel room, another poem. Translation also embodies that inspiration. Suddenly awake thanks to another author's poem in another language, appearing as creation, not only as transfer or relocation. Isn't every poem an act of translation, of vision, of the music of something dictated or the dictation of music? A sort of invisible sieve through which we are granted truths that our intellect would not be able to keep any other way. A mother tongue of languages. If Borges asserts that every word is a dead metaphor, I dare say that every death is a live metaphor. I hope the following example, a poem written after the impact of a very early loss or absence that keeps manifesting itself as presence very vividly, every day, will clarify my point. It's part of my book entitled Via Corporis. Corpse. I'm only going to read the English because I don't think we have time for more than this. Corpse. This corpse that I saw with my own eyes, who owns eyes identical to someone or something, that will be eaten or was eaten or is eaten by worms, if I'm buried in the same way someone that I never loved or called as I should was buried, too late today as yesterday. But that I imagine talking to me from her enclosure, tenderly, not distressfully. That corpse was the one I wanted you to see, dignified, not ugly, just a dead body, fresh as a spring, summer, autumn, winter morning, among daffodils, wisterias, maple, birch trees, smelling of aromas as well as of rotten matter, lacking expressions or emotions, so strange and familiar, full of textures, or organs to donate, healthy corneas, a sacred heart for whoever might have wanted to continue in the great theater of the world. I wanted you to unfold from your reality of iris and pupil in order to find yourself. I wanted to give you the courage of inanimate textures so you wouldn't depart like that. Yes, like that, without a password, just in case the moment called for it. This has been my very personal way of following the tracks of an unwaverable vocation, this one God. I am fortunate enough to have a room of my own, but it is not an angel that awaits there day by day, but a snake eating its own tail, transforming itself into a hanged man's noose. A sort of reminder that this is a serious question, not some whim or fleeting wish. The search and discovery of the venerable word, including a measure of tunelessness, a distinct voice, perhaps a bit screeching, that goes beyond the individual in order to find both the voice and the language of the tribe. It's double-edged, horrible and deep. This differentiation is completely displayed by translation, whose most important lesson doesn't lie in the knowledge of the foreign language, but in one's mother tongue, which in spite of living with one since day one, shows new faces, new nuances, new instances, new combinations, new and old prepositions, speaking of the different, new meanings and nonsenses, new demands and rigors, new escape routes towards real freedom. Good luck at first counts. That first time. The one Goethe referred to when he said that having good luck at the beginning is everything. I was lucky then when they taught me clear words, meaningful words, appropriate or not, beautiful or offensive. I must have been around 6 years old when I understood there was something beyond what was communicated abruptly at a stroke. Like, sit down, well, pass me the salt, would you? Something hidden that proliferated like certain cells, that meant many things at the same time. Here's an example. Someone was going to a party, a ball. So that someone, my sister, who's almost 10 years old. Adults asked her, do you have your non-transferable with you? Which is in the Spanish of the times is intransmisible. ¿Tienes tu intransmisible? They meant your entrance ticket. My father's family is from Yucatan, so he never lost the ways of the Southeast. Phraseology, accent, archaic usages. The day I asked him what this word actually meant, and he explained it further on, I remember telling him that when I used the word in conversation with a classmate, she didn't understand it, and even mocked me. His answer was, you know, the beauty of language tends to be non-transferable. You won't forget this, even if you have to call things in different ways. In the future, well, this I have to explain here that time I'm speaking about the 50s, more or less. Women used to wear nylons that, you know, that had a seam in the back, and when you had a little hole in it, you were lost, because then everything was broken down. And in Spanish, that is said as se fue la media. La media is the nylon, no? Se me fue la media, like the nylon is gone, the thread is gone from the nylon, whatever. This is poetic. Language is absolutely poetic. So my dad saying, in the future, your mother won't have to explain to you that her nylon was gone. If for Dylan Thomas, after the first death, there is no other, for me, after the impossible to transmit, there is only the transmissible in the poem. My good luck has had a lot to do with translation. In boarding school, I translated my first poem to save myself from loneliness, to speak with the powers that be in my language. I should say that I went to boarding school in South Dakota in the 60s, etc. The outcome of that first translation was horrible, but it forced me to work by creating and has brought me this far. It was a very small poem that, like all poems written by Emily Dickinson, they're all really small, jewels. And the nun that told me, why don't you try to translate? If you're so worried about losing your own language, why don't you try to translate this? It's a very little poem, you know, very little, but it was Emily Dickinson. So, you know, what was I to do there? Well, after 1,001 versions, Emily Dickinson says, I think that the root of the wind is water. It would not sound so deep were it a firmamental product. Airs no oceans keep. Mediterranean inclinations to a current's ear. There is a maritime conviction in the atmosphere. So the last version of 1,000 is, creo que el agua es la raíz del viento. No sonaría tan hondo de ser producto del firmamento, aires de océano sin fondo. Oye la marea, sopla, mediterránea entonación. Hay en la atmósfera, soy una marítima convicción. Whole decades had to go by before I dared to translate a poem by Seamus Heaney. You might wonder how I met the bard. Well, he was invited to a festival, to a poetry festival in Mexico. And, well, I went to his reading, and through a friend that used to work in the organization and things, I found out his address. Seamus was more or less reachable then. I mean, this was long before the Nobel and all that. So he got me the address in Dublin, and I wrote to him, and he answered, and that was it, you know? I mean, a very, very special person. Not all the Nobels are like that, you know? Very much the contrary. Don't mention anybody else. I was again lucky enough to rely on who he was. My captain, that luminous and generous being who found out my address in Mexico City and wrote me a thank you letter for my efforts. Only an extraordinary person does that. He knew the loneliness of translating poetry because he himself had practiced the craft with the same intensity and compromise he had put in his poems and essays. Each and every one of his versions of originals by other poets, be those medieval, anonymous, Anglo-Saxon, like Beowulf, belonging to the Greek or Latin classical canon, Italian, French, Polish, or Gaelic, were published along with texts he wrote full of details about the job. In fact, Faber and Faber has recently collected all of them in a 700-page volume. I have tried to follow his criteria when translating his work, bearing in mind he always granted a special place to transgression, creative freedom, careful and serious interpretation. Heaney also translated work from languages he didn't know, in collaboration with other poets and scholars, just for the sheer pleasure of it, which naturally is evidence of his unequivocal tone, his style. Of all his philosophy concerning this activity, here are a couple of excerpts I consider meaningful enough. The following one concerns the affective engine. He says, the erotics of composition are essential to the process. Some pre-reflective excitation and orientation, some sense that your own little verse craft can dock safe and sound at the big key of the language. And this is as true for translators as it is for poets attempting original work. Here's a great master speaking, of course, the author, who always included his versions among his own poems, sort of winking his eye in the lesson taught. And now here's a second paragraph, a dart directed to truth. It is one thing to find lexical meanings for the words and to have some feel for how the meter might go. But it is quite another thing to find the tuning fork that will give you the note and pitch for the overall music of the work. Without some melody, sensed or promised, it's simply impossible for a poet to establish the translator's right of way into and through a text. Translation is a poem written, it's a poem. Translation is a poem written more fearfully, more carefully, and more anxiously than any of the personal creations, regardless of how painful themes or topics could be, how difficult it is to find a form adequate to the content or predicament. One tends to think that the more one translates, the more treasures will appear. Wrong. But still, it can help a lot to keep in mind what another captain of mine, Antonio La Torre, who was my master at the National University of Mexico, my professor, he never tired of saying this. Eclectic eras are the best. Those where labels are meaningless, where effective language is all that counts. In other words, the poem as such, when showing its best face, must work, must get to the distant shore and make an impact. This is exactly what Thomas Wyatt did when he wrote a wonderful poem to Anne Boleyn. The king, Henry VIII, the king, was jealous and had him erased from court and from this world. But paradoxically, Thomas Wyatt lived forever in his beautiful sonnet, Whoso Lists to Hunt. An actual translation into English, more an appropriation or intervention of Petrarch's Una Cándida Serva. Whoso lists to hunt. I know where it's Anheim, but as for me, alas, I may no more. The vain travel hath wearied me so sore, I am of those that further come behind. Yet may I, by no means, my wearied mind draw from the deer, but as she fleeth afore, fainting I follow. I leave off, therefore, since in a net I seek to hold the wind. Who lists her hunt? I put him out of doubt, as well as I may spend his time in vain. Graven in diamonds, in letters plain, there is written her fair neck round about. Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame. Something akin to this inspiration is what I modestly tried to do when translating Heaney's sonnets in double version. I don't know if I have time. Really. I got all his sonnets together because the form was very dear to him, and so there are sonnets in all his books, so I got them together, and I did a double version of each sonnet. First a free rhythmic version, and from there I sort of passed it through the sieve of form, and I created a form, the form of the sonnet, the actual form of the sonnet, departing from that first free translation. And I published that in Mexico. And some people prefer the free rhythmic, most people, than the one subjected to form, because it sounds sort of like tense. So, I'm going to finish just very quickly. 2 pages. My versions venture very carefully and with uncertainty into the land of freedom. In one of those privileged instances, I received a change of lights from Seamus, symbolically speaking, by way of a tacit approval of what I was doing. Back in the late 80s, when my translation of Station Island was published in Mexico, Isla de las Estaciones, thanks to the goodwill and trust of Francisco Toledo, during a trip abroad, I very proudly took some copies to a well-known poetry bookshop in Madrid. I asked the owner if he was interested in having them on display. He opened the book, this guy, very much a Spanish person, he opened the book exactly on a page where the word chicharo appeared. Chicharo, sweet pea. He giggled a bit, like scornfully, which made me decide not to leave those copies there. I guess he was expecting to see instead the word guisante or something of the sort. I told Seamus about it. He made no comments then, but when I celebrated his many risky northern local words included in his translation of Beowulf, among them Bon, B-A-W-N, his answer to me was, "It's my chicharo." So, when working on the translation of several books of his, I allowed myself the respectful use of my language, Mexican Spanish, getting rid of some of my colonized person complexes, not all of them. As a way of saying goodbye to this world, Heaney wrote a kite for his granddaughter, which in Mexican Spanish has a wonderful extra Steinerish connotation, papalote. Papalotl, which in Nahuatl means butterfly. So that's the extra part that translation gives. If there's no extra bonus, then something is not really working. This is what I believe, really. With deep melancholy, I remember my first translations of his work published in the supplement Sábado, a newspaper that was popular at the time, Uno Más Uno, accompanied by a short essay I entitled From Swamp and Bog to the Depth of Air. 2 words fly on top of his last poem side by side in reference to the physical object made by Seamus's hands, as well as the ethereal object made of mirror words on one side, comet on the other, kite. A kind of monarca butterfly, mariposa monarca, in dual lepidopterous and volatile condition. Willis Barnstone, that I'm sure all of you know, one of the most respected scholars of the craft of translation, said that poetic translation inhabits permanent exile. He's right, in a way, because it seems quite a crazy thing to recycle what was already poured into another language. Nevertheless, when either spontaneously or by chance one confronts a poem in translation and is fascinated by it, not knowing it was originally written in another language. This is what happened to me when I read Bob Hass's translations, for instance. It is absolutely certain it can breathe on its own. This has happened to me many times. In fact, the before-mentioned poem by Milosz, which I knew in Bob Hass's version, I then decided to translate it from English, which is really recycling it, because it's Polish to English, and then I departed from English, not knowing Polish. But then what happened was that Bob told me he had read it to Milosz, and he found communicating vessels of sound between the 2 languages, the Polish and the Spanish. So there you go. Of course, it would have been ideal to work directly from the original, but at least traveling from a good translation into another one was an approach to what Seamus called the sound of sense. in that very moment, and from then on, I decided to keep this as a compass, a driving force in whatever I wrote, be it my original poem or my original version. Thanks very much.
Does anyone have any questions? Necesitamos preguntas en español también. So if anyone has any questions, take advantage. Writing a letter to Seamus Haney, and then that person, and then Seamus writing back to you, is the equivalent of writing a letter to, say, Steven Spielberg, and then he writes it back to you, or someone like, I don't know, you think of Shakespeare, for that generation, and Shakespeare writing a letter back to you. So that's a heavy letter. So, does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
So, as I said at Georgia Poetry and Georgia Lecture, I was really intrigued at how open and excited you are about translation. I've only ever heard people like, say, professors of like Spanish or whatever, like, no, I like poetry, I'll read translation. Well, what you lose is the poetry translation. So they say things like that. So I was really excited to hear you say that. So whenever you read people who have translated your work, what do you find? Give me like some examples of things that that the translation opened up for you in your own poetry.
Yeah, well, it's a matter of taste, basically. I like some of the translations that add something to what I try to say because of the other language that is intervening, and it's offering that. The translations of Forrest Gander are the best in many ways, even if he doesn't really know what I am talking about. You know what I mean? I mean, it's sometimes, for instance, I had a discussion, a very bizarre discussion with him about this expression in Spanish, entre azul y buenas noches. I don't know if you've heard this expression. Something that is not really clear, that is confusing. You say it's between blue and good night. I mean, literally speaking, no? Entre azul y buenas noches. And Forrest told me, I'm going to translate that literally, just like that. And I said, no, you should find an equivalent. I said, no, because if I do the literal part, the poetic dimension is going to be expanded. And he was absolutely right. So it depends on how fantastic a translator you get. In the case of Forrest, I couldn't be luckier. It was just amazing. I have had other translators confront my work, and they are fearful, which is, Forrest is not in the least, he just decides to be as free as possible according to sound, following that. If you're too careful, you end up with nothing, really. And Robert Frost was really wrong, because it's not poetry that is lost in translation, not really. It can be lost, definitely, but it depends very much. I had this experience I wanted to tell Jaime about when I translated Louise Gluck. I loved her poetry so much. I did that. I found out her address, through Bob. And I wrote to her. She never answered. Yeah, but I kept writing. So I said, yeah, well, as my father used to tell me, toca la puerta hasta que te abran. Knock on that door until they open it. Okay, so no, I wrote to her several letters. And when I finally decided, this woman, I think that I am, overdoing it with her. She's not Emily Dickinson, really, so that day I received an answer from Louise Gluck, the day that I was about to give up. An answer, one line in a letter, signed and everything. And I told her, I got this scholarship to come and be with you some days so we could probably work together. She answered immediately, don't lose your time. And then I wrote back and I said, I'm not losing my time. I just want you to listen to what I'm doing. And then she didn't answer, and I took the flight. And I called when I was near, and I mean, there was no point, you know, about having that door closed all the time. So she was in Harvard then, substituting for Seamus, by the way. Seamus had gotten the Nobel and all that. And then I found out why she had this attitude. It's not because she was a horrible person. She was not really. She was like embarrassed of not knowing other languages. So she's not even Italian, which is a language that I'm more or less familiar with, whatever. I respect languages too much, and I'm not going to have, you know, the slightest inkling of what you're doing. And I said, no, but that's why I'm here. I'm here to explain it to you, and if you like it, great. If not, I'm going to publish it anyway. So, because this is unfortunately, it's a business transaction. If your editors sell the rights, publish it, you know. But the editors were adamant, I mean, they guess they were in agreement of some sort. Oh, then she wrote, you know, a very gracious letter thanking me and whatever, and I published 2 of her books, Ararat and The Wild Iris. And this was also like Seamus long before she was who she was and everything. But she was not really friendly or anything like that, you know.
I've read her poetry. I think she's wonderful, but I'm not at all surprised based on what I've read that it's a little chilly there.
Yeah.
That, I mean,
Good to stop there. You're more than welcome to stay. I want to thank everyone for coming. Please take some food because I don't need the diabetes. I want to thank you all again. Thank you again. Everyone,